They were, for all intents and purposes, the landlords of New York City. A family so rich they owned immense swaths of Manhattan. Their name was etched into the very fabric of the city they helped build. From Astor Place to Astoria, Queens, you can still feel their influence today. They were America's first dynasty, a clan of ruthless ambition and unimaginable wealth that began with a German immigrant and ended in a Gilded Age empire that made them royalty in a country that had supposedly gotten rid of kings. Their fortune was, at its height, almost impossible to comprehend, giving them the power to shape the destiny of a city and a nation. But what happens when the landlords of an empire are finally evicted? Not by a rival and not by a market crash, but by something far more relentless: time itself. This is the story of the Astors, a dynasty that rose to unimaginable heights and then simply vanished. They left behind a legacy of ambition, scandal, and a profound lesson about just how fleeting power in America can be. Their saga isn't just about wealth. It's about the very soul of New York and the impossible dream of building something that lasts forever. The story of the Astor dynasty doesn't start in the grand mansions of Fifth Avenue, but in the humble village of Waldorf, Germany, with a butcher's son named Johann Jacob Astor. Born in 1763, he was the third son in a family with little to offer him but the smell of the slaughterhouse. But Johann, who would later anglicize his name to John Jacob, had an ambition that was just too big for his small town. At 16, he left for London to join his brother in making musical instruments. It was there that he heard tantalizing stories of America, a new world where a man's future wasn't written at birth. In 1784, with a handful of flutes and about $25 to his name, John Jacob Astor set sail for the United States. He arrived in a young nation still finding its footing, a place of immense potential for anyone with the guts to seize it. A chance encounter on the ship with a fur trader changed the course of his life. He learned of the massive profits to be made from the pelts of beavers and otters in the vast, untamed wilderness of North America. After a short stint working at his other brother's butcher shop in New York, Astor jumped into the fur business. He was a natural. Sharp, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, Astor wasn't content to just run a shop. From his home base in New York, he masterminded a commercial web, sending agents deep into the wilderness to deal directly with Native American tribes. He learned their languages, understood their networks, and wasn't afraid to use liquor and deception to get the best prices. By 1800, he had amassed a fortune of $250,000 and was a dominant figure in the global fur trade. In 1808, he established the American Fur Company, a venture so powerful it would become the first great American monopoly. His vision was continental. He financed expeditions deep into the American West, establishing a network of trading posts that stretched to the Pacific, with a settlement even bearing his name: Astoria, Oregon. Astor's enterprise was a global machine. He shipped American furs to China, trading them for tea and silks. He even dabbled in the controversial and illegal opium trade, selling the drug in Canton before stepping away from that venture. He multiplied his profits at every turn. He was a master of logistics, a political operator who courted presidents like Thomas Jefferson, and a businessman who saw opportunity where others saw risk. The fur trade made John Jacob Astor an incredibly rich man. But it was his next move, a pivot born from an almost prophetic vision that would transform him into the founder of a dynasty. He saw that while the demand for beaver pelts might fade, there was one commodity whose value in a growing nation was all but guaranteed: land. Specifically, Manhattan land. On his deathbed in 1848, John Jacob Astor, by then America's first multimillionaire, was reported to have said, "Could I begin life again, knowing what I now know, I would buy every foot of land on the island of Manhattan." That one sentence perfectly captures the strategy that turned his commercial fortune into a dynastic empire. While other wealthy men built ships or factories, Astor began buying up dirt. Starting around 1799 using the profits from his global trade, Astor began systematically purchasing vast tracts of land on Manhattan. But he didn't buy in the bustling heart of the city. Instead, he looked north, past the city limits, to the rolling hills and farms that made up most of the island. He bought huge parcels of what was then considered cheap, undesirable farmland, including a 70-acre farm that stretched from what is now 42nd Street to 46th Street, west of Broadway. He acquired the massive estate of the disgraced Aaron Burr, a huge parcel that now includes much of Greenwich Village. To his contemporaries, it seemed like madness. To Astor, it was the future. He correctly predicted that New York was destined to explode northward, turning his cheap fields into the most valuable real estate on the planet. His genius, however, wasn't just in buying the land, it was in how he held it. Astor rarely built on his properties or sold them. His motto was simple: buy and hold, let others improve. He pioneered a leasehold system that would become the bedrock of the family's wealth for generations. He'd lease out plots of land, often for 21 years, to tenants who then had to build their own homes or businesses at their own expense. When the lease expired, the land, and whatever building was on it, reverted back to Astor. He could then either raise the rent to an astronomical new height or evict the tenants and take the building they had paid to construct. It was a strategy of breathtaking patience and brutal effectiveness. As the city grew, the TCA value of his holdings skyrocketed, and the ground rents provided a river of passive income that flowed endlessly into the family coffers. This strategy made the Astors the undisputed landlords of New York. By the late 19th century, the family was said to own more real estate in the city than anyone else. Their name was on everything, from grand hotels like the Astor House to endless rows of buildings. When John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he left behind an estate valued at an estimated $20 million, making him the wealthiest man in the United States by a staggering margin. He had single-handedly created a fortune unprecedented in American history, but in doing so, he had also sown the seeds of a dark legacy. He built an empire on land, but that land was often home to the city's most desperate people, and the name Astor would soon become synonymous not just with wealth, but with suffering. The monumental task of managing this fortune fell to John Jacob Astor's second son, William Backhouse Astor Sr. If his father was the visionary predator, William was the diligent, methodical accumulator. Less flamboyant, but just as obsessed with wealth, he dedicated his life to one purpose: consolidating his father's real estate empire. He became known as the Landlord of New York, a title that spoke to the family's utter dominance over the city's property market. Under William's watch, the Astor fortune more than doubled, reaching an estimated $50 million by his death. He kept up his father's buy-and-hold strategy, acquiring even more land and overseeing the construction of over 700 stores and homes across the city. The family's wealth became a self-perpetuating machine. As New York's population exploded with immigrants in the mid-19th century, the demand for housing was insatiable, and the Astor's land soared in value. They literally grew rich in their sleep. But this fortune had a dark and squalid underbelly. Much of the income that funded the Astor's lavish lifestyle was wrung from some of the most miserable housing in the Western world, the tenement slums. The family was one of the largest owners of tenement buildings in New York, especially on the crowded Lower East Side. These structures were built cheaply on the family's land, often covering so much of the lot that they choked off all light and fresh air to the rooms within. The conditions were horrific. Tenements were fire traps, packed with families into tiny, unventilated apartments. Sanitation was nearly non-existent, with overflowing outhouses and small yards creating a permanent stench and breeding diseases like cholera and tuberculosis, which killed thousands. For the immigrant families living in these buildings, life was a daily struggle in the shadow of the Astor name. The family became the face of a system of ruthless exploitation. They were absentee landlords, happy to collect rent from afar while their properties fell into disrepair and their tenants suffered. The slumlord. Accusation began to cling to the Astor name, a stain that would be hard to remove. While William Backhouse Astor Sr. did make some token efforts to renovate a few tenements after being stung by public criticism, the core business model didn't change. The family's immense wealth was now tied directly to the misery of their tenants. This created a troubling paradox that would haunt the family for generations. As they prepared to climb to the very peak of American society, they would do so on a fortune built not just on land, but on the suffering of those who lived on it. The higher they climbed, the darker the shadow they cast. As the 19th century entered its final decades, the Astor fortune, now in the hands of the third generation, had swelled to an estimated $75 to $100 million. This was the Gilded Age, a time of extravagant wealth, rapid industrialization, and brutal social warfare. And at the dead center of this glittering, backstabbing world stood one woman, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known to everyone as the Mrs. Astor. Caroline, who married William Backhouse Astor Jr., wasn't an Astor by birth, but she would come to define the family's social power more than any man who bore the name. In a New York flooded with nouveau riche industrialists and railroad barons, Caroline made it her mission to be the ultimate gatekeeper. She saw herself as an aristocrat, the guardian of old money against the crass intrusions of new wealth. With her social advisor, Ward McAllister, she created the most exclusive club in American history. The 400. The number wasn't random. It was supposedly the number of people who could comfortably fit into Mrs. Astor's opulent ballroom. To be on that list? You'd made it. To be left off? You were a social nobody, no matter how many millions you had. On February 16, 1892, the New York Times published the official list, a mix of old money families and a few carefully chosen new money swells, like the Vanderbilts, who had finally earned their spot. Mrs. Astor's reign was absolute. An invitation to her annual ball was the most coveted prize in New York society. She'd receive her guests standing like a queen, surveying her court. The evenings were spectacles of unimaginable opulence, featuring dinners served on solid gold plates. This was the peak of the Astor dynasty. They were no longer just the landlords of New York, they were its royalty. Caroline Astor didn't just throw parties. She shaped the city's cultural landscape, lending crucial support to new institutions like the Metropolitan Opera. The family displayed its wealth in the monumental mansions they built along Fifth Avenue, each one grander than the last. They weren't just building tenements anymore, they were building palaces. Yet, even at this pinnacle of power, the cracks were starting to show. The rigid social order Mrs. Astor fought so hard to maintain couldn't survive the chaotic energy of modern America. And the most immediate threat wasn't from the outside, but from within the Astor family itself. An internal feud born of pure ego was about to erupt and create one of New York's most iconic landmarks as an act of architectural spite. While Caroline Astor ruled New York society, a bitter resentment was brewing within her own family. The source of this bad blood was her nephew, William Waldorf Astor. Having inherited the larger slice of the family fortune, Willie, as he was known, felt that he and his wife should be the true heads of the Astor clan. The feud boiled down to something that sounds almost petty today, the title of Mrs. Astor. Caroline continued to style herself as the Mrs. Astor, the undisputed matriarch. Willie was incensed. He believed his own wife was now the rightful holder of that title. Frustrated and fed up, Willie decided to strike back in the most public way possible. His father's mansion stood right next to Caroline's on Fifth Avenue. In an act of spectacular revenge, he had his family home torn down. In its place, he began building a massive 13-story hotel designed to tower over his aunt's home and literally cast a shadow over her social world. In 1893, the hotel opened its doors. Willie called it the Waldorf Hotel, a nod to his family's German hometown. The Waldorf was an immediate sensation. It was hailed as the first hotel to offer electricity and private bathrooms in every room. revolutionary luxuries at the time. For Caroline, it was the ultimate insult. The Grand Hotel next door had made her mansion untenable as the center of society. Humiliated, she and her son, John Jacob Jack Astor IV, made a strategic retreat. They would abandon their home, move further up Fifth Avenue, and fight fire with fire. They tore down their own mansion and, on its site, began building an even larger, grander hotel. In 1897, the 17-story Astoria Hotel opened, deliberately taller and more opulent than its neighbor. For a brief time, the two monumental hotels stood side by side as monuments to Astor arrogance. Eventually, however, business sense won out over family drama. The cousins reached a truce, and the two hotels were connected by a grand, 300-foot-long marble corridor. This hall became famously known as Peacock Alley, where the rich and fashionable would stroll to see and be seen. The combined structure was named the Waldorf Astoria and was hailed as the largest and most luxurious hotel in the world. It was a symbol of the Astors' immense power, but also a permanent reminder of the divisions tearing at the dynasty. In a final twist of irony, the site of their Gilded Age triumph would later be demolished to make way for another icon, the Empire State Building. The story of the Astors is a gripping saga of ambition, legacy, and the relentless passage of time. If you're finding this deep dive into New York's history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our future explorations of the figures and families who shaped our world. John Jacob Jack. Astor IV, the man who built the Astoria Hotel, was in many ways the epitome of a Gilded Age Astor. He was a real estate magnate, an inventor, and even a science fiction novelist. He managed the family's vast real estate holdings and built other landmark hotels like the St. Regis. But he would not be remembered for any of that. Instead, his name would be forever linked to the most famous maritime disaster in history. In 1909, Jack Astor shocked society by divorcing his wife, and 2 years later, at age 47, marrying the 18-year-old Madeline Force. The scandal was immense. To escape the public outcry, the couple embarked on a long honeymoon in Europe and Egypt. In early 1912, with Madeline pregnant, they decided to return home for the child's birth. For their journey, they booked passage on a brand new ship making its maiden voyage, a vessel hailed as a marvel of engineering, a ship they called unsinkable, the RMS Titanic. As the wealthiest passengers on board, their presence added to the voyage's glamour. They traveled with a small entourage, including a valet, a maid, a nurse, and their Airedale Terrier, Kitty. But on the night of April 14, 1912, around 11:40 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The Titanic struck an iceberg. Survivor accounts paint a picture of Jack Astor as remarkably calm in the face of chaos. He woke his young wife, helped her dress, and assured her that the damage wasn't serious. On the boat deck, he remained composed, even reportedly cutting open a life jacket to show Madeline what was inside to reassure her. When it was time for women and children to board the lifeboats, Astor helped Madeline into collapsible Lifeboat 4. Citing her delicate condition, he asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller if he could join her. The request was denied. Astor accepted it without argument. He simply asked for the lifeboat's number, told his wife he'd see her in the morning, and stepped back. John Jacob Astor IV was last seen smoking a cigarette on the deck as the great ship began its final, terrifying plunge into the North Atlantic. His body was recovered a week later. He was the richest man on the Titanic, worth an estimated $87 million at the time. But in the end, his fortune couldn't save him. His death was a stunning blow. It felt symbolic. The unsinkable man, heir to an unsinkable fortune, had gone down with the unsinkable ship. For the Astor dynasty, it was the end of an era. The Gilded Age seemed to die that night in the frozen ocean, and the family's sense of invincibility was shattered forever. The immense fortune of John Jacob Astor IV passed to his 20-year-old son, Vincent Astor? But Vincent was a different kind of Astor. He was haunted by his father's death and by the family's reputation as slumlords. Unlike his predecessors, whose main goal was the relentless accumulation of wealth, Vincent became preoccupied with rehabilitating the family name. Vincent Astor represented a major break from family tradition. He saw the real estate empire less as a cash machine and more as a social responsibility. He embarked on a mission of philanthropy that was unprecedented in the family's history. He began selling off the most notorious parts of the Astor portfolio, including many of the dilapidated tenement buildings. In a move that would have been unthinkable to his ancestors, he sold some properties to the city on generous terms to help create the nation's first public housing project, known as the First Houses on the Lower East Side. His philanthropic vision extended far beyond housing. He established the Vincent Astor Foundation, a charity that would donate tens of millions of dollars over the decades to causes like the New York Public Library, which his family had helped create, as well as hospitals and community centers. Vincent's actions marked a turning point. He was, in effect, presiding over the slow, deliberate dissolution of the great Astor fortune. Where his forefathers had hoarded, Vincent gave away. He was a progressive figure who understood that the era of the Gilded Age barons was over. The enormous concentration of wealth in one family's hands was no longer seen as a mark of greatness, but as a social problem. Through his good works, Vincent Astor did much to cleanse the family name, but his philanthropy also accelerated the family's decline. The empire that John Jacob Astor had built with such ruthless determination was now being gracefully dismantled by his great-great-grandson. The eviction by time was well underway. After Vincent Astor's death in 1959, the Astor dynasty, as a central force in American life, effectively ended. Without a male heir, the main branch of the family fortune went largely to the Vincent Astor Foundation, continuing his charitable work. The other branches of the family had spread out, many moving to England to become British aristocrats. The name still carried weight, but the immense power it once held was gone. The Astors faded from the headlines. Their Gilded Age mansions were torn down, and their story became a chapter in the history books. But the family name would be dragged into the spotlight one last tragic time, in a scandal that provided a grim postscript to their epic story. The scandal centered on Brooke Astor, Vincent's widow. After Vincent's death, Brooke took control of the Astor Foundation and became one of New York's most beloved philanthropists, a figure known for her elegance and generosity. For many, she was the last great Astor. As she grew older, her health began to fail, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. It was during this time that the final, ugly chapter of the Astor story unfolded. In 2006, Brooke's grandson filed a lawsuit alleging that his own father, Brooke's only son, Anthony Marshall, was a victim of elder abuse. The lawsuit painted a horrifying picture. It alleged that Anthony Marshall was plundering his mother's fortune while neglecting her care, leaving her in squalor and selling off her valuable artwork. The case became a media sensation. In 2009, Anthony Marshall was convicted of multiple charges, including grand larceny for defrauding his own mother. It was a shocking and humiliating end. The great Astor name, once associated with absolute power, was now linked to a tawdry tale of elder abuse and family greed. The dynasty that began with a butcher's son seeking his fortune had ended with the son of New York's queen being convicted of stealing hers. From a butcher's son arriving in America with a few flutes to a dynasty that became the very landlords of New York, the story of the Astors is the story of America, written in extremes. They were the architects of the American dream on an almost unimaginable scale. John Jacob Astor's visionary gamble on Manhattan real estate laid the foundation for an empire of dirt and stone that shaped the city's destiny. His descendants built on that foundation, reaching the pinnacle of social power during the Gilded Age, where Caroline Astor reigned as the undisputed queen of a new American aristocracy. But their empire, for all its seeming permanence, was built on a fault line. The same ruthless ambition that fueled their rise also led to a reputation as cruel slumlords. The family's internal feuds became the stuff of legend, building monuments of spite like the Waldorf Astoria. The tragic death of Jack Astor on the Titanic symbolized a turning point, shattering the family's aura of invincibility. And finally, the slow, philanthropic dismantling of the fortune by Vincent Astor and the pathetic final scandal of Brooke Astor's last years marked the quiet end of their reign. Today, the Astor name echoes throughout New York. It's on a subway stop decorated with beavers, a nod to the fur trade that started it all. It's in the name of a neighborhood in Queens. These are the remnants of a fallen empire, the ghosts of the landlords who were ultimately evicted by the one force they could not buy, control, or conquer: time itself. Their story is a timeless cautionary tale about how fleeting wealth and power can be, and it leaves us with an enduring question. In the end, what is a legacy truly worth?